Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you are in the world. Welcome to our webinar for today. And for today, what we would like to talk about is preparing for all wildlife in the Asia-Pacific region. This is part of our program this week in OSRL, which is this week we tagged as Wildlife Week. So again, welcome to everybody in joining and thank you for joining us in this webinar. But before we start, there are some ground rules that we would like you to do as participants of this training. So please take note that the presentations that we're going to deliver for today will not be provided or will not be sent out to you. However, the presentations are recorded. So once we have collated all the presentations will be uploaded into the OSRL website. Please do visit our website for more information with regards to this presentation, for this recorded presentation. And also, we would request the participants to be always respectful. If you have some questions or if you have some comments, please do avoid using all capital letters in the chat box. Please keep your microphones at mute at all times. And if you have questions with regards to the topic or any questions in general regarding to this webinar, please do type your messages or your questions in the chat box and we will attend to them. Your questions will be answered during scheduled stops during the presentation. For today, the OSRL team that will deliver this webinar to you will be myself. Good afternoon, my name is Norman Ramos, and I also have my colleagues with me, Ms. Sharina Shah Navas and Mr. Yo Lee Hearn. And also, we are honored and pleased to have our friend and our colleague from Massey University, Wildbase, Dr. Louise Chilvers. So I will let Dr. Louise Chilvers to provide an introduction of a bit more of herself later on her presentation. So let's start. Let's talk about the oil wildlife preparedness and response. And what we would like to talk about right now is our experience and our observations with regards to this discipline on this response strategy in Southeast Asia. So this is the summary of the oil wildlife response in Southeast Asia. And as you can see, it is quite evident that Southeast Asian countries or ASEAN countries wouldn't have a formal guidelines or plan with regards to oil wildlife preparedness and response. And I would make that comment that one of the leading country in ASEAN is actually Malaysia, wherein Malaysia would have their own formal plan with regards to managing oil wildlife. And aside from that, Philippines would also have an oil wildlife response plan. However, the plan that the Philippines have is not actually available in public domain. But however, it should be noted that there's an agency that is leading the oil wildlife response in the event of this incident. So actually in the Philippines, this is led by the Biodiversity Management Bureau, which is under the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. And also it is interesting to see the differences in approach with regards to oil wildlife. So for example, most of the countries would have rehabilitation as part of its oil wildlife response. However, when you talk about as the sensitive topic on euthanasia, this becomes a bit of a question mark with regards to most, if not all, of the Southeast Asian countries. This is so because in our region, in the ASEAN region, I think what we could say is that we have a diversity in culture, a diversity in religion. That is why the approach on euthanasia may not be that straightforward. And a couple of things to note also in this table. Of course, Laos, our brothers in Laos, they do not really have a formal guidelines or plan because, as you know, Laos is a landlocked ASEAN country. And another country that worth noting is Myanmar. As we know, Myanmar is actually in a political issue currently. That's why they are not able to move forward with regards to these types of plans. Now, if we try to think about, or what we have found out in ASEAN is that we have 4 main findings and observations with regards to the oil wildlife preparedness and response. So these are, first and foremost, at least in the ASEAN region, there is a limited or reported oil wildlife incidents because there's a lack of regulatory framework or plans pertaining to oil wildlife management. So basically, if something is not regulated, then definitely it will not be reported. The second aspect to this is lack of awareness on the issues of the oil wildlife management. Again, this could be attributed to the first one because there's no regulatory framework, and therefore it is expected that there's a lack of awareness on the issues of the oil wildlife. Next, this indicates that the welfare of wildlife is not priority during preparedness and response. So basically, when there is a response, normally the oil wildlife bit is actually at towards the end of what we call the recommended response strategy. Normally, we would think about use of booms and skimmers, use of dispersants, and the oil wildlife would be towards the end of our list. So because what we have observed is that the welfare of wildlife is not a priority. And lastly, I think this is one of an important aspect as well, at least in the ASEAN region where we have our own share of big spills, is that currently what we have observed is that possibly there is limited or to no wildlife impact to at least of those oil spill events that we have experienced here in ASEAN. So that's why there could be limited information or reported oil wildlife incidents. Right, so after this observation, my colleague Sharina will talk about the preparedness bit with regards to oil wildlife response, and then followed by Lihern and Dr. Louise. So I'll pass it now to Sharina.
Thank you, Norman. So for my section, I will actually provide some insights on the preparedness aspects for all the wildlife, specifically in the Southeast Asian region. So if you look at this wheel here, so some of you might already be familiar with this tiered preparedness and response wheel. Essentially, this wheel encompasses the 15 areas of response capability that are most commonly required to mitigate the consequences of an oil spill. And you can see here that oil wildlife response is depicted as one of the wedges in this wheel. And according to the Good Practice Guide, the definition of this oil wildlife response is the equipment as well as expertise that are required to locate, capture, as well as rehabilitate these oil wildlife. So by including wildlife response in this good practice model, IPICA, then IOGP actually had set a target for individual oil companies as well as for the industry to better understand the tiered preparedness for wildlife response, and also how do you operationalize wildlife response capability to meet the defined response objectives. Okay. Another wheel here that is relevant is the Wildlife Response Preparedness Wheel. So this wheel actually reinforces a cyclical, or rather a continuous approach to developing wildlife response preparedness. So it involves a progression, sort of like a progressive steps to first develop a written wildlife response plan, and then to implement and operationalize this plan over time. And that can be done through investments in Tier 1 and Tier 2 capability, trainings, exercises, as well as ongoing evaluation and improvement. So if you look at this model, it also emphasizes the importance of having a Tier 3 expert and organization in the process of developing this in-country preparedness. So the reason for this is to help to ensure that these efforts are founded on a good practice, and that there is an existing relationship with your Tier 3 resources that will be relied upon in a response to a major incident. Okay, so one of the things that that we see over the years working with authorities and industry is that regulations, specifically in the Southeast Asian region, they do not cover wildlife oil by pollution. So there are existing regulations on, say, hunting, rehabilitation, but they do not specifically cover oiled wildlife. So in the next couple of slides, I will talk you through, what are some of the aspects that regulators should consider when coming up with a framework related to oil wildlife. So this sort of called a wish list in a way. So if we look at it, a high-level consideration, so this should be more focused from maybe the perspective of regulators and authorities. And we talk about philosophy towards oil wildlife. What is the general direction for the country? So I think Norman has mentioned this a bit, whether within the country, whether euthanasia is something, that is regarded as an option for response. Or is it just focused on rehabilitation, or is it a combined strategy of both? The third point, roles and responsibility. Roles and responsibilities of various authorities. So it's important to actually be aware within a country, who is the authority that is responsible for the overall management of all the wildlife. I'll give a case study on this later. And then, of course, when you have identified the authorities that is responsible to oversee the management, what about the management structure? What about the overall strategy? Okay. And then the next part here is media and communication. So we all know how social media actually plays a very critical role. And if, let's say, the public captures picture of, cute oil birds and things like that, and that picture gets circulated, it goes viral. All these actually plays an important part in terms of media and communication. So this needs to be looked into as well. Financial feasibility, this is often overlooked, at least within this region. There is no funding mechanism for managing oiled wildlife. Okay. And long-term program, so consider exercises, trainings that will equip the regulators with the necessary skills to oversee an oil wildlife response. And not just from the regulator's perspective, but should there be a defined program for the industry to follow suit as well. Okay, so other than that, of course, when you have, you think about oil wildlife response, you have to have considerations on what are the processes and procedures that follow suit as well. And in some countries, there are vulnerable, threatened species. What should be the approach for that? How do you handle these species which are under conservation? The point here on facility, shelter, food preparation, these are a bit more detailed, but is there a guidance or a process or procedure to follow in terms of, finding the appropriate facilities to handle an oiled wildlife response? Training and volunteer requirement. If you think about it, you might have volunteers who are keen and passionate to help with managing oil wildlife during an incident. So have a look into how to screen these volunteers. Do they have the right skill sets, for example? And this does not have to be something that you wait for during a response time. It can be looked into during peacetime. Looking at any research institutes, any NGOs that can support an oil wildlife response. So this can be done early on during the preparedness, during peacetime. Documentation, how do you pull all these aspects together? Ideally, it is good to develop a plan which is aligned with your National Oil Spill Contingency Plan. So I think Norman mentioned briefly about Malaysia, the Department of Environment Malaysia, together with the industry, they developed this Malaysia Oil Wildlife Response Plan. So this plan is actually integrated with the Malaysia Oil Spill Contingency Plan, and it aims to provide guidance to responders from other agencies on how do you respond in the case of wildlife impacted by oil spill incidents. And then if you look at the Southeast Asian region, we talked about there's so much diversity in beliefs, in cultural, and like rightfully mentioned by Norman, euthanasia can actually be a sensitive topic, and this probably needs to be something that that regulators can look into. What is the overall strategy? So if I can quote an example, in Philippines, There's a Republic Act 9147. I think that one is on conservation and protection of wildlife resources and their habitats. So there is a statement there, or a clause that states that the killing of wildlife is illegal unless it is deemed necessary to put an end to the misery suffered by the wildlife. So that clause itself, it doesn't specifically mention all wildlife, but it mentions wildlife in distress. So it's probably an indication that the country is amenable to euthanasia. Okay. And finally, having technical handbooks or guidelines, this can be something that is useful for industry operators or even regulators. Okay, so we talked a bit about philosophy just now. So just to give you an example, so when we talk about philosophy, that derives from the values of the society towards the treatment of wildlife, which in turn, these actually impacts the strategy that the country adopts, for example. So the range of philosophy can be represented in a spectrum from pro-animal welfare all the way to non-intervention. So at one end, where animal welfare is the societal norms in the country, then the response actions could be, proactive capture. You're doing a preemptive capture to prevent the oil from reaching, the turtles or its eggs, for example. Active treatment of all the wildlife, and then euthanasia may also be part of the conservation. And then for non-intervention, the other end, the response actions would gear maybe towards minimizing human interaction during spill cleanup effort. And then it only involves maybe close monitoring of wildlife mortality rate, for example. Okay. So here in OSRL, we actually have worked extensively with authorities within the region, and specifically in Brunei as well throughout the years. So we will share some general approach that we can see through their existing regulation. So for Brunei, there is a Wildlife Protection Act of 1981. It lists all these protected animals in Brunei. So there are these different species of turtle, the green turtle, hawksbill turtle, the leatherback turtle, as well as dugong. And the Act also establishes a wildlife sanctuary in Brunei. So the law specifically provides the provisions on hunting, killing, and capture of wildlife. But like I've mentioned, it does not include harm done to wildlife due to the pollution. So it doesn't address wildlife that has been impacted by an oil spill. And also for Brunei, the euthanasia of wildlife is not mentioned in this law, so it's silent on managing severely injured wildlife. Okay, so there is a report on the Convention on Biological Diversity, I think a 5th national report, if I recall. So it indicated that there are 6 marine protected areas in Brunei. So I think coral reefs and coral communities are also part of these marine protected areas. And it also recognizes that industrial discharges or spillages could actually pollute the marine environment. And in Brunei, these marine parks and marine reserves falls under the jurisdiction of the Fisheries Department. And then at the same time, there is the Department of Environment, Parks and Recreation. In short, we call them JASTRE. So JASTRE has a jurisdiction over shorelines that are impacted by oil. So then there's the question of, how do you address this overlap of legislations and jurisdictions? How does JASTRE work with Fisheries Department in the event that we have protected animals in the marine protected areas that are impacted by oil spill? So then it's actually important, one of the recommendations that we provided is actually it's important to sort of have a clear definition of what each department is responsible for or what should they oversee. Okay, and this is my last slide. So I will hand it over to Dr. Louise, who will sort of wrap up the preparedness part by sharing a case study. Dr. Louise, over to you.
And I am the Director of Oil Wildlife Response for New Zealand. Our team within Massey is employed full-time by Maritime New Zealand, the government organisation in New Zealand that's responsible for marine oil spills. to be New Zealand's oiled wildlife response. So really, I'm just following on from Charlene's description of what a Tier 1 and Tier 2 in-country response can look like. So how do we respond? There's really 4 main factors which were already covered off. We respond using trained personnel, we have facilities, we have equipment, and we have planning. So the personnel at Massey University within Wildbase, we have a full-time oiled wildlife coordinator, that's myself, or the equivalent of a wildlife branch manager, and a rehabilitation specialist. We then have full-time wildlife hospital and rehabilitation vets, 8 vets, and 8 vet nurses and technicians, because within the university we run a wildlife hospital and a rehabilitation centre. Then nationally within New Zealand, we train the oiled wildlife response team members that are distributed throughout New Zealand. And then we have a range of volunteers and also training into zoos and NGOs that do wildlife rehabilitation. Our NORTS, National Oiled Wildlife Response Team, and our volunteers have a wide range of skills, both technicals, ecologists, veterinarians, capture specialists, but managers and emergency command specialists. As a rule of thumb in New Zealand, we work to, if you have 100 birds in a spill, it will take you about 50 people. So our last major spill, the Embury Rena, the incident we had at any one time 407 birds in, and we had a total of 250 people involved in the oiled wildlife branch. So 20 people in command, 80 people in the field, and 150 people in the wildlife facility. As I said, we are contracted by Maritime New Zealand, the government organisation, and we are fully integrated into the IMS system. So you will see here intelligent planning, operations and logistics branches. So we have officers in all of those branches. We have wildlife reconnaissance supervisors and wildlife advisors sitting under intelligence. We have planning officers in the planning division, and we have logistics officers in the logistics. The majority of our team sits under the operations manager. So you will see there the wildlife coordinator, or also known as the wildlife branch manager. That's my position. And then the rest of the facility is sitting under that. Just to expand just that area under operations, that's what it looks like. That red circle is the same thing. That's my position. And then everything in green is the field team. So you have shoreline cleanup, marine mammals, reptiles, transport, and then you have the facility. So with facility supervisors and all the compartments within the facility that you would have, including facility managers who build and run the facility. For New Zealand, you have a post-mortem area, but then your intake, stabilisation, pre-wash, wash, rehabilitation and release. Equipment-wise, we have 3 levels of equipment within New Zealand. We have first strike, response trailers, and then the national equipment stockpile. The first strike equipment is distributed in every region or state across New Zealand. So these are boxes that hold 24 to 48 hours worth of equipment, which is used for hazing, capture and transport. PPE for people, it's really only for the capture and hazing of animals for about up to 50 birds and 20 responders. We then have second strike equipment, which are response trailers, which are distributed in the 4 main areas throughout New Zealand, 2 in the North Island and 2 in the South Island. That's for another additional 50 birds, and it has the ability to be sent out as a remote stabilisation site. It has protection, it has hot and cold running waters. And then we have the national stockpile, which is held at Massey University with the vets and the responders there. And I guess the main thing about our equipment and ourselves is that we are a completely mobile unit. Facility-wise, although we have a permanent small facility at Massey University, we are predominantly a mobile unit. We have 4 20-foot containers, which are packed with gear and washing equipment, and those can be transported anywhere around New Zealand within 24 hours notice to be able to set up facilities anywhere in New Zealand. This is a picture of the Rena Oiled Wildlife Facility, and I'll quickly run through how it ran. So right here you had the intake of oily birds, and the stabilization and triage process, then the wash, rinse and dry, which carries on in here. That's the rinse, and then the stabilization area, rehabilitation for the pools. We had once the animals are washed, it still takes at least a week for them to realign their feathers and become waterproof. So these were the avian arenas that we were keeping them in. We had areas where we preemptively caught animals to prevent them getting oiled in the first place. Then we had a necropsy lab where the animals were necropsied if they were to investigate what their cause of death. And then, of course, areas to prepare food for the animals and for people. Lastly, our organisation within New Zealand is based around planning. So not only do we have a national chapter within the National Plan for New Zealand, we have regional and special area plans, and within Massey standard operating procedures for how our facility would run. These plans specifically look at risks for species and areas, responders contacts, local resources and logistical support, pre-identified wildlife response facilities, and sensitive areas and preferred response strategies. So I think that sums up how a Tier 1 and Tier 2 operation could operate within a country. That's certainly how it operates within New Zealand. Back to Norman.
Thanks, Dr. Louise. So before I pass the session to Lee Hearn, I think I'd just like to remind all of our participants that if you have any questions, you can actually write that down in the group chat, and then we will address your questions as we go along in this presentation. So Lee Hearn.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you see my screen? I have started sharing.
Yes.
Yes, that's good. So thank you for coming to the webinar. So the next part that I'm going to talk about is actually the response part of the wildlife, and my focus is actually more on the integration of the wildlife response into our existing other oil spill response strategies, which is what we have been very familiar. And what I would like to also highlight is that what the wildlife response is not just what we always think of, capturing the bird, cleaning them, and releasing them. Actually, there are a lot more than just that. We have other principles, and I'm going to bring you through just that. So let's go back to the basics in terms of wildlife response. So what we had mentioned earlier, or what Dr. Louise has showed us, where the facility is, you have to capture the bird and to clean the bird. Actually, that goes to the third tier of, let me open up my pointer, the third tier of the wildlife response, and that is actually the last one of the 3 tiers. So let's go back to the 3 tiers. For the very first principle, we call it prevention. So what prevention essentially means that we have to keep oil away from animal, and that actually will not allow any wildlife to happen in the first place. So that is actually the very first preferred principle in terms of wildlife response. And then next, when we go into the second principle, the second tier, which is mitigate. So that is where you keep the animal away from oil. So if we can't, because oil has very big impact by itself, so we can't really control where it goes. So if we can't keep it away from a very sensitive area where there might be animal nesting grounds, there might be a lot of heavy wildlife presence. So what we can do is then we keep the animal away from the oil. So there are certain actions, certain strategies we can deploy to do that. And of course, when the worst case happens, the oil and the animal, they come together, they become the oil wildlife. So what we can do is, of course, the conventional capture, rehabilitation, and release of the wildlife. So so I will not go through all three of them in details because going through everything would probably take up another 2 hours. So I don't want to snatch away the limelight. I will just focus on mitigation, where I will give you a background of what we can do on mitigation, the conventional oil wildlife strategy in mitigation, and actually Dr. Louise will come in with her case study on one arena where we have a very successful demonstration of how this mitigation can work. And after this, actually, I will talk about the integration itself, or how these principles could be integrated into our oil spill response strategies. So let's go back to the mitigation that I mentioned that we as a second here that I would want to zoom in. So what we can usually do in mitigate is that first thing, we do preemptive capture or displacement. So that would be, of course, we need to know that definitely the oil is going to this direction, and at this direction, the end target is a very sensitive wildlife. So we have to remove the at-risk wildlife before even the oil comes. So what we can do is, of course, we can capture them and put them somewhere in a care facility where the risk of oiling is over. That means the oil has been removed, and then we can put them back to the environment. Or we can actually capture them because we want to minimize any captivity because they are wildlife in the first place. So we'll actually relocate them in another location that's fine. Now, when they return back to the original nesting ground, the oil has been cleaned up. Another way is, of course, we do not want any wildlife to come close to the area. So what we can do is we have hazing techniques. That means we put anything that is actually scary or anything that is uncomfortable for wildlife to stay in that habitat. So they will avoid this area that's at risk of being oiled. And of course, this technique is the success rate. It depends on the wildlife species. So it probably is more suitable for birds, and for reptiles such as turtle, snakes, or any other reptiles, then it would not be working for this. So the next one I would want to go into, of course, is the case study I mentioned earlier. And the case study is MV Rena. I'm sure actually everyone is quite aware because it's a very, very well-known example of a successful wildlife response. I will not go through in details of what have been done. I just highlight certain key numbers. So it was a tier 3 spill, and it was activated because of the potential wildlife incident. So what happened was that there were predominantly little blue penguins that were captured preemptively and then released at another location. Released back in the wild, and after the washing and cleaning. So there were about 95% success rate that were captured, and we actually always depends on this number, but we do not know what exactly went behind in terms of deriving such numbers. Which fortunately we have Dr. Louise here. She has a lot more details on what exactly happened to this 365 or 383 little blue penguin, and how did we study them to know that actually they eventually had a good survival rate. So over to you, Dr. Louise. Have stop sharing.
So I will talk about how after the RENA, or during the RENA, we undertook post-release monitoring to understand how well the animals that we rehabilitated or that we preemptively caught did back in the wild. This is a little blue penguin. He is usually blue and white, and you can see he's definitely not blue and white in that photo. So anyone who is not sure of the background, the MV Rena hit Astrolabe Reef on the 5th of October in 2011 at 2 a.m. in the morning. I'll just quickly go through the mortality that we recorded during that spill, survival and reproduction of the animals that we brought into facility, and looking at a few other things that we monitored once they went back into the wild, like diving and hormone stress levels. So just an indication, the Rena spill was quite a long one because not only did the ship hit the rock, but then a month later it broke up. So here is the first 6 weeks of animals that we collected off the beach. That was some were oiled and unoiled, but in the first 6 weeks, we had 1,376 animals brought in that were oiled and dead, and 687 that were unoiled and dead. They came from 47 species, but note here that the first week, 67% of them came in. So it's a really large, and this is about preparedness for oiled wildlife, that you have to be prepared because usually it's the first week where everything happens. This fourth week is when the ship broke in half. So again, more oil was released. Just an indication, so the MV Rena hit a rock off here, but we actually found dead oiled animals over a 360 kilometre spread. So right from the East Cape all the way up to Papanui. Even though animals are oiled, sometimes they will travel a long distance before they die. So it's also about preparedness over quite often a longer distance than what you're imagining, and much further than what the oil is spread. So post-release monitoring. So of the little blue penguins that came in, 383 were cleaned, rehabilitated, and we microchipped them and released them. And at the same time, we had 361 unoiled penguins that were out in the environment continuously. And so we microchipped them as well so that we could monitor, have a control to the animals that we rehabilitated. So it was really looking on what was the survival and the reproductive ability of these animals once they were rehabilitated and put back in the wild. So survival, the animals were released with chips in their neck, just in the back of their neck. And so those long yellow things here, looks like a bit of a Star Wars saber. You can put that down the hole that the penguins live in and read the chips without disturbing the birds. And so we followed the birds through laying eggs, through hatching, and all the way through to their chicks being old enough that we could chip them as well and follow the chicks. This graph is put in here for an understanding of the first year survival records. So a month after the Rena animals were released, penguins molt once a year, and molting penguins is the definition of misery. It is a time where you have to leave them alone. They're shedding all of their feathers and growing new ones. And so they're quite stressful animals. So we leave them alone when they're molting. And so this is re-sighting over 2 years. And when you do re-sighting, you're looking for a re-sighting curve to level off. And this means that you know that you've got all the animals. So you can see in the first year, because here's the first year, that we really hadn't reached that re-sighting curve yet. So that's just a bit of a description. Here is the survival. So this is control versus rehabilitation. So you can see actually in the first couple of months, the rehabilitated birds had a higher survival than the control birds. The main reason for that is that most rehabilitated birds come out of a facility in very good condition. We have fed them lots. They didn't have to go and feed their own. So their survival was slightly higher in the first month. They then averaged out, and as you can see, there was no difference. You can also see, and as noted down here, first year average survival appears low, but it's mainly because of our low re-sighting ability of the animals. Once the ability to re-sight the animals became higher, you can see that their survival is the same as the control animals, and actually they were very high and similar to little blue penguins throughout the rest of New Zealand. We also looked at reproductive success, and so animals that either had, or nests that either had 2 controls or one animal or two animals that had been rehabilitated. And really the main thing to look at is fledgling success and egg success, and there was no difference. There was a slight drop in number of eggs hatched, but compared to New Zealand-wide numbers for little blue penguins, you can see that these figures are very high relative to the range across New Zealand. So we were very pleased with these figures. So this showed that our rehabilitation was successful and that post-release survival and reproduction of oil-rehabilitated penguins was similar to that of non-oiled animals throughout New Zealand and Australia. We then looked at other factors such as diving behaviour. So this is a dive chart. This is the surface along here, and this is water depth. So remembering that these animals are only a foot tall, they're doing pretty amazing dives down to 19 metres. And this is very typical of a little blue penguin. So they start diving at about 5 o'clock in the morning, and they more or less dive all day until they come back ashore after it's dark at night. So again, we caught animals that had been rehabilitated and animals that had not been rehabilitated. And you don't need to read all these figures, but the main thing is they were diving the same numbers of dives per hour, the same mean depth and the same mean duration and surface interval as the non-rehabilitated animals. They were back and performing completely normal behaviour for them. It also indicates that the environment that they are operating in, so the environment that had been oiled, has returned to a normal environment, and they could be feeding pretty shallow, short, shallow dives, which is beneficial for animals, and overall, and still showing survival and reproduction of the same as little blue penguins, both in Australia and New Zealand. So again, another indication that the rehabilitation process that we put them in through came out the other side, and they were fully operating members of their environment. The last one, which is a bit of an unusual one, but is about hormone responses. When you rehabilitate an animal, you don't want it to become habituated to humans, and you don't want them to become oversensitized to humans. You can see here an example of how little blues are blue and white, but when they come in from an oil spill, not so much. So, like you and I, little blue penguins, when they have a stressor, the brain reacts and releases a hormone from the adrenaline gland that causes a stress response, and it should be short-term, a release of energy so it can run away or fight. However, if that is not a short-term release and becomes long-term and chronic, it can cause reduction in survival, suppress reproduction, and immune suppression. So these are obviously things that we don't want. We didn't want the animals to become habituated to us, think that we are, even back in the wild, that they're going to be fed, but we also didn't want them hiding in their hidey holes, absolutely scared of humans around them. So what we did was you capture the animals, and at time 0, you take a blood sample, and then every 15 minutes you take a blood sample. And what you want to see is exactly what you can see here, where at time 0, the cortisol level is low. Once their body reacts to being caught and stressed, it increases, but then it starts to decrease again. As you can see, even though the rehab is slightly lower than the non-rehabilitated animals, which is what you would imagine, because the non-rehabilitated animals have never been handled by us, it still shows exactly the same curve, and they are still within the same confidence interval of each other. So again, that showed that there were no different stress hormone responses between the rehab and non-rehabbed animals. And that indicates that the little blue penguins that we rehabilitated from the oil spill were not habituated or oversensitized to humans. And this is mainly because the process that we put them through was a very minimum contact process, and that was very important. So I think overall, for us, it's very important for us to measure how well we did, not from just purely when the animals are released from the facility, but into the longer term, their survival and reproduction and their diving ability after the release. And all of these studies were up to 2 years after the release. this is very important for us, for an animal welfare, conservation, and for industry, public and government. It's about expectations and the ability for those animals to not only be survive, but go back into the wild and be productive members of their ecosystem. So this slide is just a summary of my 2 talks about preparedness. It involves people and knowledge, facilities and planning. But as Luhan talked about, the 3 steps of all wildlife response, the first 2 is keep oil away from animals. And if you can't do that, keep the animals away from oil. And last is the capture, wash, rehabilitate and release. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Louise, for the very insightful numbers. For those data-driven people like me, so I think those are very good details that, I mean, for the first time for me, that I see for MV-RENA itself, that there are actually quite a lot of studies, post-monitoring studies to back up the data that we have seen, the 95% success rate that we have seen in our case study before. So it's actually a very good explanation to back up the numbers. So let me go back to my presentation. What we went through just now is the classic typical oil wildlife response itself. So now let's talk about how the response, the 3 principles I mentioned earlier could be actually integrated into our other conventional spill response capabilities. So before I go into that, of course, let's not forget the core of our TPR view actually is the IMS, so Incident Management System. So we all know that any form of response in an incident is started at the planning stage. So during the planning stage, what we do is that we set our objective, and with the objective, we know what exactly we need to do. After knowing what we want to do, we need to get the resources to support the tactics, and that towards the end, of course, is the execution of the action itself. So this is actually a core principle in an incident management system. And of course, integration is very critical to ensure efficient collaboration. So what we have seen on the right here is actually a textbook illustration of how wildlife sits under the IMS itself. So usually the wildlife branch director sits under the operations section chief. So if you could remember what Dr. Louise has shared earlier, so in New Zealand, they have a slightly different structure in the sense that they have coordinators sitting under the other different sections. So that actually is a form of integration, because you could not imagine there are a lot of other informal collaborations required to ensure first the sharing of resources, and second to meet the need of a wildlife response itself. So if you can recall, so in MV-RENA, at the peak of the incident, they had 250 people just sitting under the wildlife branch or wildlife-related positions. So that is a lot of people and a lot of work required. And let's not forget, let's go back to our OSRL Wildlife SLA services. So what we can do as a member of OSRL, of course, to alleviate some of the personnel requirement, of course, we have this new GOWS, the supplementary services, is that you have 4 wildlife assessment team that could be integrated into your both the incident command post as well as on the field. So this 4 are there to actually do the ground assessment, whether a full-scale wildlife response operations would be required to be set up. So this is just something that relates back to the IMS. All right, so let's move on to the response capabilities. So I think I only picked 3 response capabilities, and for each of them, I will actually first illustrate how the IMS part would the type of collaboration would be required, and then it goes on. The next part will be on the 3 principles. So let's go on to first surveillance, modeling, and visualization. So this is a very critical, usually required part of all oil spill response. So I will start with this. So from what we know, so of course surveillance and modeling, they are required because they provide us with critical information. So area surveillance, boat surveillance, they provide us with confirmative information on the location of the spill. It can be used. They also can be used to quantify the spill volume at the same time. But actually, we could make use of them if there is enough communication, early sharing information to look at wildlife related information. I will talk about that later on. And of course, last thing in terms of modeling is the trajectory information. So it gives us a predictive information. So it tells us how likely the spill slick is going to head in under 3 days time, 5 days time. So this gives us a sufficient planning time in case of a shoreline impact or in case of a likely impact to a wildlife congregated area. So what type of information usually would be required from the surveillance and modeling? So example, protected areas and nature reserve. So that could be actually part of the surveillance. So with enough collaboration between the wildlife branch and the situation unit leader, so they can actually provide that information for surveillance, and after which it would be the visualization part. So visualization part is to actually allow critical or useful wildlife information to be displayed onto the status board. So that could allow the decision makers to make a good and timely decision with regards to response strategy. So what kind of information? So other information, example, your ESI, environmental sensitivity index, and shoreline sensitivities. Usually this could be found with the planning section chief himself, because the person who should have an environmental unit lead under him. So that would be already provided by will be self-fulfilling. Next, actually, we will need actually these 2 information that is relevant, that require relevant coordination between the wildlife branch director or the planning director under him to have a good communication between them to ensure such information are displayed. So this is visualization. So how visualization or how SMV then could be translated or could be integrated into the wildlife response principle. So the first one, I forgot to explain the logo just now. So if we go back to 3 principles, so the first one, prevention, it has a stop sign. Mitigate is to keep animal away from oil, it has a scarecrow sign. And the third, of course, remedy, we care for the animal by cleaning it up. So this is a hand with a heart-shaped logo. So let's go back to the principle of SMV in relation to our wildlife response. So first, under prevention, stop sign. So this actually, SMV provides a lot of information, a lot of data that informs the presence of wildlife. And this allows the decision makers to conduct a balanced trade-off with other sensitivities. So they would then decide, all right, which is the one that is my priorities, which is the one that I would want to protect more. So that would formulate a relevant response strategies that prevent oil from impacting area with sensitive wildlife in the event that they decide that the wildlife is at a higher priority. So what are the other response strategies or response techniques that could be part of the strategy? I will discuss that later. Then next would be under mitigate. So that is to keep the animal away from oil. So under this principle, SMV occurs with modeling. You know what is going to happen in next few days' time. It give us a early preparation to prepare for the relevant mitigation method. So it will also be dependent on the species that is present in that area itself. And lastly, of course, with surveillance and modeling, so with surveillance, you could actually give early detection of wildlife impact because because from surveillance you can actually identify likely some wildlife might be impacted or it has impacted certain areas that has high wildlife presence. So this give a warning sign, and then the decision could then be made, of course, to undertake a ground assessment. So you want to send some people to go to do a closer assessment to determine whether there's a need to establish the wildlife rehabilitation procedures. So this is how SMV relates to the three principles. Moving on to dispersant and containment recovery or other at sea operations. So what integration or what kind of communication or collaboration required within the IMS itself is that we need the wildlife branch director to provide the technical information that help to input into the net environmental benefit analysis or to impact mitigation analysis, NIMBA-SIMA, in formulation and response strategy. Actually mentioned earlier on, the wildlife branch director, he has the information of what are the species that are present and what species are more sensitive, which one are more endangered. So this provide a list of what is available as well as a list of what is more priority. So this can give a lot of information when the incident commander approve the response strategies that is being proposed by the operations section chief together with the planning section chief. So this is the communication required between them. Of course, the wildlife branch director can also provide the specialist input to the operations section chief with regards to certain specific operations. So example, for dispersant spraying, it would be the distance of the dispersant application zone, how far it should be, so that the dispersant plume that has been that with the oil that has been dispersed into the water would be sufficiently diluted when you reach the sensitive area. So again, how this dispersant or containment recovery would relate to the ORF response principle would be a lot of under the prevention. So you don't want the animals, the wildlife to get oil in the first place. So I mentioned earlier is critical in terms of the formulation of response strategies. And so what are the response strategies that could be applicable? Of course, we have the surface dispersant. It's very on the surface. If it is a subsea incident, you could do subsea dispersant application as well, of course. The next one that falls largely into the same category with dispersant would be chemical herders. So it is still experimental at the moment because it has yet to be operationalized in terms of how we should do the application. But what chemical herders do is it acts as a chemical boom. So it prevents oil from reaching a specific area that we want. Because we can do in situ burning, but in this region, in situ burning might not be applicable because of a lot of regulation in ASEAN that ban outdoor burning. And lastly, of course, is the containment and recovery. So you do the mechanical recovery, then the oil will not be on the surface, and then it will reach the sensitive area with wildlife. So this is under dispersant, containment recovery, into the burning. The last one I would want to talk about is the SCAT, shoreline cleanup assessment technique. So this one is also quite a important technique that requires a lot of collaboration between the wildlife branch and the planning section. So usually the SCAD team sit under the planning section. So what they can do, of course, before even the SCAD team is out to do the survey, if we do not know what is out there, whether the oil has been impacted at all, so what the wildlife branch they can make use of the SCAD team is that they through this sharing of resources, they can get them to know what are the endangered species to look out for, any specific area to pay attention, and any general wildlife expected to be present while doing their routine SCAD survey. Because in a SCAD survey, it is more designed to focus on the terrain, the oiling profile, and the subsequent response to the specific shoreline segment. So if we have a good briefing between the SCAD and the wildlife branch, we could actually make use of them to pay attention of wildlife impact. Of course, if required, then if required, or if we already know there are quite high possibility of a wildlife impact, then the wildlife specialists from the wildlife branch could be actually part of the SCAD team, where they go together and conduct the physical and closeout survey. So at the same time, while the SCAD team, they draft out the operational response plan, the wildlife specialists could provide input on the type of operational response required and for the specific segment of shoreline. So what the wildlife specialists, of course, would look at the same kind of information, like the type of wildlife presence, the wildlife habitats, and presence of odd wildlife occurs. So if there's odd wildlife, how do they proceed with the rehabilitation, the capture, rehabilitation, and cleanup of the wildlife? So the collaboration is mainly between the recon specialist and the SCAD person. So this is between the two, during these two phases in the SCAD. So SCAD, how it relates to the principles again. So it has relevance in all three principles. First, under prevention, of course, it informs the presence of wildlife. This is quite similar to the surveillance and modeling, because these are all the information and data that is the critical in making decisions. So same thing applies here. And next is under the mitigate, keeping the animal away from oil. So during SCAD, of course, you can actually confirm the presence of wildlife itself and how detailed and very detailed information, such as whether it is a breeding ground, it is a nesting ground, and the numbers of wildlife seen. So that could actually, and of course the species. So all this would impact the subsequent selection of your mitigation method. So if you see birds, then you would select a hazing method that would be more suitable for birds. And lastly, of course, under the remedy, which is to capture the animal. So what we can do, of course, is during SCAD, it would actually confirms whether wildlife has been impacted. So if wildlife has been impacted, same thing, you would need to it's an indication for you to undertake a ground assessment to determine you need to establish a whole wildlife rehab procedures. And of course, you also informs you whether you in terms of waste management, in terms of procedures that you need to collect and handle any oil carcasses as well. So in terms of collaboration or informal communication, it will be then the hazing supervisor, the fuel capture or transport supervisor, or the fuel stabilization supervisor that has to be in communication with the SCAD coordinator. So these are the three response strategies I have attracted to talk in depth. Let's just have a look in overall what other response strategy could be related or could be integrated with the wildlife response principle. So this is just a summary, and if you are interested, of course, then we can talk about that. We'll go through this in our training, which Norman will be talking about that later. So over to you, Norman.
Before we talk about the training, let me quickly go through the Q&A first. So I think we got a couple of questions here. So I think, can I request my co-presenters to on their video? Right. So I think one of the question is for Dr. Louise, or actually all of the questions were for Dr. Louise. So question is, you have an impressive sort of stockpile of equipment for all wildlife response. So how do you go about maintaining those significant volume or significant numbers of equipment?
Thank you. The equipment is owned by Maritime New Zealand. We are contracted to Maritime New Zealand, so they, similar to any oil response organisation, they have technicians who are responsible for making sure the equipment is up and running. Our first strike boxes are maintained by the National Wildlife Response Team member within the region, because nothing in that is mechanical. And apart from things like nitrile gloves, nothing in there expires. And then everything else is maintained by Maritime New Zealand because it's their property, and yeah, they keep an eye on it. So hopefully that answers your question.
Right. So basically, it's not Wildbase Massey University doing the maintenance of this equipment.
No.
Yeah.
We certainly facilitate, and we know how to do it, but and do the checks once a quarter that is not mechanical, and make sure we let Maritime New Zealand know that they're done. But no, it's not our overall responsibility.
Okay, a couple more questions for you, Dr. Louise. So you talked about, in your case study, post-monitoring studies, with especially more specifically on the RENA response. So question is, who typically pays for the post-monitoring studies, and who carries out the post-spill monitoring?
Right. We do both. Post-monitoring studies are not paid for by the spiller. Everything up until release is paid. But we feel it's a very important part of our job to make sure that we know and understand what happens to those animals once they've been through our process and are released. And as we are a university, we have the ability to apply for funds and also to undertake that research. But that is only a case in New Zealand. Likes of in America, it is the spiller's responsibility to pay for that sort of research. And funnily enough, I would certainly try and encourage that in New Zealand. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think to provide more context on that question is that who carries out and who pays for this. I think the response of what Dr. Louise talked about is specific to New Zealand, but definitely each jurisdiction, each country would have its own way of dealing on how should this be paid and who will be paying for this. Like in US, like Dr. Louise mentioned, this is being paid for by the responsible party. And also, it depends on the source of the spill. So, for example, if the spill is ship-sourced, ship-related, so for example, tankers or say bunkers, so like those type of vessels, then there would be like a compensation regime or compensation convention that should be followed with regards to who would be paying and how it should be carried out, or how would the post-spill monitoring would be sort of reimbursed from the responsible party. So this is quite, I would say, a very there must be a deep answer to this, but definitely it depends on the regulations, depends on the conventions which on which country is a signatory to, what is actually the type of spill or the source of the spill that happened. So it's not really like a straightforward answer wherein the responsible party would be the one paying for this. Right. We have another question. This time is for Lee Hearn. Lee Hearn, question is, how can we facilitate information sharing in the IMS structure during response? I think you might need to put a bit more clarification on this.
Okay, that's a very good question. I'll try to answer this. So I think there are maybe two ways that how we can facilitate information transfer. So first, of course, you formalized it.
Lee Hearn, we lost
Coordinator.
Yeah. Lee Hearn, we lost you for a bit. Can you repeat what you have said?
Yeah. So there are two ways that we can facilitate information transfer. So first, you formalize it. That would be how New Zealand has done it in their ICS structure, in the IMS structure. You can, if you still can recall, they have wildlife coordinator in every other planning, in every other sections. So that kind of information transfer actually is done to that dedicated person. The person actually knows what has to be required from different sections, and it also has relevant information from the wildlife branch itself. So this is a formalized approach, and that occurs require a lot more resources. We need more people to fill up those positions. Then the second way, of course, will be done. It has to be done through awareness. So so the relevant positions in relevant sections, they have to know who else they need to look for and what kind of information he can get from other sections. So how do you then get this kind of awareness? Then that would be done through training exercise. And one training, of course, would be to go through that slides that we have designed, which Norman will talk about it later.
Yep, sure.
If you are interested, you can stay tuned for Norman's explanation later on. So I hope I answer your question.
Yeah. Any other questions from our participants? We have a bit time to respond to your questions. And just to summarize our presentation, our webinar this afternoon, basically we have talked about what is the status of oil wildlife response in the Asia Pacific. And as you can see, it is in a full spectrum. One, if you look at New Zealand, you have a very full budgeted, full force sort of oil wildlife response and preparedness, and going to ASEAN, wherein again is another spectrum wherein some countries are prepared and some countries are not. And as we have mentioned, our observations regarding this matter is mainly on the awareness, mainly on the regulation. So that's why, and of course, it also indicates that the welfare of the wildlife is not really taken or given importance. Sharina talked about on the preparedness bit, and also Dr. Louise talked about on the preparedness bit. Sharina talk more on the regulatory bit that would be really important to consider when thinking about oil wildlife preparedness. And of course, it was followed out by Dr. Louise's presentation with regards to what are the important sort of aspects in having an oil wildlife preparedness. Then it was followed up by Lee Hearn, wherein we talked about how we could integrate oil wildlife into the normal response strategies that we already know. I think most of the time, people would always think that oil wildlife response is a separate response from the typical response that we know, like booms and skimmers, dispersants, in situ burning, and scat and shoreline cleanup. Actually, they are not independent of each other, but more so they are integrated or they are interdependent with each other. And normally working together would be the best way. Collaboration would be the best way to make sure we able to address such incidents. And I think another point to consider, aside from this, is that you think about oil wildlife as early on as well. It is not something that you should be thinking towards the end. And there's a lot more to wildlife response rather than rehabilitation or euthanasia or cleaning up the birds or capturing the birds. But actually, it's a full suite of things that you could do like what Leahern and Dr. Louise mentioned, prevention, preventing the oil to hit or preventing the oil to reach the animal. You would like to mitigate. You would like to prevent the animals going to the oil. And of course, if that fails, then what you have is the last bit, which is remedy, wherein you have to go through your rehabilitation, release, cleaning, and of course, if it comes to that, it could be also euthanasia could also be part of it. Any more questions from our participants? Right. So, okay. So this is just to sort of inform our participants of this webinar to talk about that OSRL and Massey, Wildbase of Massey University. We developed what we call a remote oil wildlife response training for decision makers. So basically, what is this oil wildlife training for decision makers? So basically, this is not a training for us to capture birds or rehabilitate birds, but more so this training is more for managing and making sure that the oil wildlife is embedded in your IMS, in your incident management system. So basically, it's an integrated wildlife planning and response strategies to wider response. So again, as we have mentioned, wildlife response is not an isolated sort of a strategy, but it is an integral part of the oil spill response. So this course that we have developed between us and Wildbase of Massey University, this is customized for the incident commanders, section chiefs, technical specialists, more so for the environmental unit lead and wildlife specialists, and of course, wildlife branch management and wildlife strike team. So through this training, what we would like to really make sure is that we would like to, again, to integrate how we could sort of integrate the wildlife response strategy into your incident management system. So basically, it's an overview of IMS together with oil wildlife response strategy. So these are the content that we have developed for this sort of training. So it talks about regulatory frameworks on oil wildlife. It talks about how would you incorporate wildlife response in incident management system. While Massey University will talk about the wildlife overview of wildlife response, what would be a wildlife protection response strategy, how are you going to develop the preparedness. Of course, we would also talk about the impacts and effects of oil spill to the wildlife in their general ecosystem, health and safety aspects, significant number of case studies, and of course, a tabletop exercise to sort of synergize all the learnings in this program. So please do watch for the space with regards to this training. So this will be a published course for us, and just watch. You can visit our website and then check out on the schedule when will this happen. Right. So I would like to check again before I go to feedback. Let me check again on any more questions with regards to our presentation. Right. So if no more questions, we would like to request our participants to scan the QR code in front of your screen. And I'm sure if I shared it correctly. So let me just quickly share it.
Yep, all good.
Yeah, right. So yeah, so to all our participants, so thank you so much for taking time to attend our webinar. And we would be grateful if you could scan the QR code and provide us feedback with regards to this webinar. And we hope this has been a very productive webinar or sort of information exchange for you. And again, we thank you so much. And then we will hope to see you soon